Hi everyone. It's one of those sunny but very cold mornings in Canberra, and I actually went to the supermarket in my pyjamas this morning because we had no milk. It's that kind of morning, but it's a morning to make a video. So today I've got a little plan here, and the plan comes from talking to Camille and Kenza, and they're at the Paul Bocuse Institute in France. And we had a very quick call because of the time differences. It was midnight for them. It was 8:30 for me in the morning, about how to plan a workshop for helping people with interdisciplinary thesis work. And I promised a video of some of the techniques that I suggested to them, which I'm going to do. But then I thought it could be a good video that just records how I actually plan out a workshop, because it's quite a good method. And a big shout out to Joyce Seidsiger at Cat's Pajamas on Twitter, a friend of mine who showed me how to do this in the first place. This is my slightly modified, sorry Joyce, I mucked around with it, version of how to plan a workshop using an activity matrix. So I'll show you the plan, me making the plan, and then I'll show you some of the techniques. And then maybe Camille and Kenza, you can run this workshop, or maybe you just take some ideas, or maybe you do whatever you like. Okay, I'm going to rotate down. I'm going to do it with the pencil because I can, and it's fun. Okay, let's go. Here is my activity planner template. It's quite simple. You've got a series of columns and a grid. So basically these columns are as follows. We've got time, that's how long each exercise is going to take. We've got theme, what we're actually going to talk about. We've got what the presenter's doing. So this is notes to yourself, you know, you're showing slide decks, what are you doing? And then here's the trick, here's what your audience are doing. And that's a really handy thing about this audience template, is it makes you think, what are they doing while you're doing something? And if they're doing a lot of listening, that's probably not a workshop because they're not doing any work. Okay, down here I put a resources column. And this reminds me of what I need to take into the classroom with me. Okay, so let's plan out this workshop for Camille and Kenza, or the workshop they might be able to do. First thing you do is decide how long it's going to be. And so that length here of time, let's say it's 3 hours. 3 hours is good because it's like a morning before lunch. You don't have to provide lunch if you haven't got enough funds and so on. I always put in a longer break here at the start, just to remind myself that, you know, we need to actually stop at some point. And I usually make that a 15-minute break at least. So plan everything around that break is a helpful way to give your audience a bit of a rest. Okay, so the first thing that you usually do in a workshop is just have an icebreaker of some kind. These people have maybe met each other, maybe they don't know each other, and maybe people are coming in late. And they come in late a lot. At ANU, it's a very large campus, people have to run from place to place. I actually usually run my icebreaker time over about 15 minutes. I know it seems like a long time, but trust me, by the time you've had trouble with the technology and people haven't found their tables and they need to sign off, you really need a 15-minute settling in time. So the presenter just sort of, here I'm just like, you brief the people on the activity. And what I usually do for my icebreakers is just give each table 3 questions to answer. Or you can give them 1 question, which is why you're here. So I like 3 questions. Usually I have a slide up here with the 3 questions on it, and it just gives people on the table something to talk about and gets the room kind of warmed up. So here in my resources place, I'll remember that I need PowerPoint, and I need tables, cafe style. And that's maybe all I need for that particular exercise. Okay, so that gets me started. If you were going to ask 3 questions about interdisciplinary research, you might ask, you know, what are you working on? What are the issues that you've encountered? And you might ask, why are you here? Or why did you come today? So they're good 3 questions to get people started on. And you can have a little brief report back if you want to wrap that activity up before you get into the guts of the actual workshop. Okay, So the next thing that I suggest that Camille and Kenza do is a diagram exercise. And I would say, you know, you've got to give this one a good hour. I know it seems like a long time, but we've got 3 hours to kill here after all. So we've got an hour-long exercise here, and we're going to do an audience diagram. And what I'm going to do as the presenter is I'm going to demo and talk about the diagram, answer questions, and then the audience is they're going to listen to me talk. So I've got to make sure that I note how often they're listening, and then they've got to draw diagrams. And I'm saying draw diagrams in groups. It just gets people working together, harnesses all the brains in the room. And so this reminds me that I need whiteboard texters. And they're going to need something to draw their diagrams on. I like A1 post-it notes. They're like huge post-it notes that people can stick on the wall and work on together. And the advantage of those is that they can take them away with them. We also need some texters. Okay, so you can see how this resource column starts being very useful, but just as a checklist of things to take in with you, especially if you're taking this kind of workshop on the road and you're briefing people that you haven't met yet. You can tell them what you need in the room, and people really appreciate this kind of diagram. Okay, so at the end of that, you might do a debrief where you get people to talk about the diagram. Okay, I'm just going to show you what the diagram looks like now. Like my Shine Dome note paper. I'm pretty happy. Took it from the Shine Dome yesterday. Thank you, Shine Dome. If you don't know the Shine Dome, it's a building in Canberra that actually looks like that. It's pretty cool. Okay, so here's the diagram that I'm proposing that Camille and Kenza run. Now, you could do a number of ones, but I think probably this one's the simplest and the easiest. First of all, you try and identify the different potential audiences that you have for your thesis. And I'm just going to start with 2 audiences. You might have more than 2, up to you. So if it was my thesis that we're talking about, the question behind my thesis was, what work does gesture do? I looked at hand gestures in the design studio. So I was filming teachers and students talking to each other, and I was cataloguing what kind of gesture types they used. And so there were 2 main audiences for my thesis. So I'm going to draw them as a Venn diagram like this. One audience was gesture scholars. Yes, there are a lot of gesture scholars out there. Lots of work, 200 years worth of work on gesture. And then there is what I think was the primary audience, which was architecture academics. They're the people who have to teach, and they might be interested in what work their hand gestures are doing. Particularly, they might be interested in hand gestures because they're always been asked to teach online. It's very hard to translate the work that gesture does online. And so this thesis gave them a whole bunch of arguments about why they wouldn't want to work online, well, at least not online the way that most online systems are designed. Okay, so what I propose you do is you try and identify what does each audience know already. So if I have a list here, they know all about the idea of gesture as a spectrum. A lot of people think that gesture, and they think of a sign language. And actually, gesture scholars know that it's not that organised for the most part. If you had a spectrum, you have sign language up one end, spontaneous gestures down the other, and anything in between like army gesturing and things like that. So they understand gesture as a spectrum. I don't think architecture academics would do that, so I'm not putting it in the crossover here. One thing that architecture academics understand is about the design studio as a sort of pedagogy. And I think that a lot of gesture scholars don't necessarily know about that, so I'm putting it over in this part of the vector. So we're talking about gesture scholars again. They might know things about prosody. So how gesture is timed with speech. I don't think architecture academics would know about it. They'd know about gesture mirroring, how people tend to sort of gesture like the people that they're looking at, which is really important to consider in terms of teaching. And they might sort of know about some of the common ways that gesture typologies are categorised, and I don't think architecture academics would know about that. But they would know about the design process. They would know something about the history of their profession and how those classrooms ended up like that in the first place. And they know all about drawings and representations, and so how to sort of make architectural things. So you notice that nowhere have I written anything in between. That's my thesis right there. But it also tells me by doing this Venn diagram that each audience potentially for my thesis don't really know anything about each other's world, which is actually either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. The way that I solved this problem was to say, well, there's 2 literature reviews. I basically wrote 1 literature review for each audience, and I just said in the introduction, you can skip that one if you want to, if you already know enough about it. But I mean, the intention is that anyone reading the thesis would read both. So you might find that when you do this exercise that there's actually a lot of crossover there. And then you might decide to start your literature review. Instead of having sort of 2 literature reviews like I did, you might start your literature review with that crossover, and then you might extend it into a couple of extra little bits that were about one audience and then another audience, and just keep them a subsection. So I think that sort of diagram might be really helpful for planning and to talk about it. And I'd recommend in this case, if you've got a group of people, to pair and share, so that you work on one person's diagram. That way the person can talk about it and they can workshop it with another person, and then swap over. So that would take you for your hour-long exercise, if you gave half an hour to each person, maybe even a bit longer. Okay, I'm going to put my plan back here. So then I'm going to do a break, and after the break, one thing that I talked to Kenza and Camille about was how important it was to think about the language in an interdisciplinary thesis. So not everyone speaks the same language, and in fact sometimes it comes down to very particular ways that sentences are written. So I'm going to make this another hour-long exercise, whereas this one was a pair and share. I'm going to make this one into a single activity. I think it's solo activity. Okay, and then we've got a demo and questions. And I'm going to call this language analysis. It's quite a good workshop. I should run this workshop. Maybe ANU students want me to run this workshop. Hey, email me, people. Maybe I'll do it. Okay, so what I'm planning to do actually is to get people to bring in a paper. And I've got a paper that one of my favourites is What to Do When Feeling Bored, Student Strategies for Coping with Boredom. I've got this little obsession with boredom since I did the MOOC in 2015 where we had a whole chapter about boredom. I've got all this literature on boredom. It's quite fun literature. Okay, so for that exercise, they need to bring printouts. So you can see how absolutely useful, and thank you again, Joyce, for showing me this method, this resource column is, because in your briefing to them, you need to tell them to bring that. Okay, if you don't tell them to bring that, you need to have some spare, something generic, and actually something like this boredom paper would be really good, because I could have a couple of copies of that just sitting around for the people who forgot to bring anything, or people have got everything on their devices these days. They should bring their laptops with them. So you put laptops in here, and so they can do it on the screen if they want to. They don't have to bring a printout. So if they forget, you've got spares, or they've got laptops, so you're covered. Okay, so what I'm planning to do in this particular exercise is to take them through an analysis process. And this analysis process is from our forthcoming book, and the book's called Writing Trouble. And it's all about, me and Catherine Firth and Sean Lehman wrote it. It's with Open University Press at the moment. It's coming out on the 23rd of December. And this is one of the exercises that we do in it. So one of the things that we do is point out how different disciplines tend to treat references. Okay, so in the humanities, when a reference is put in a literature review, there's a reference. You see that it's usually followed by or close to a verb. Now, the person who talked about this the most is Hyland. Okay, so Hyland did a series of books, they're really excellent, about how different disciplines use verbs and various other types of linguistic analysis of different disciplines. He was very useful when he talked about verbs in the context of humanities versus science. And this is a good paper because it's kind of an interdisciplinary paper itself. And a lot of papers in education are interdisciplinary. You know, they draw on literature from psychology and from, sociology, ethnography, sometimes even science. So they're a good case study of different ways that referencing might be used. So the standard way of referencing in the humanity is to put in a verb like that, and in that verb defines, what the author is doing is that they're putting a position, this is Hyland's theory, that they're sort of positioning themselves in relation to that work. So defines is a nice verb to use because defines in itself suggests that there's some scholarliness going on there. They've done some definition work. So you contrast that with Hebb and Doneri mark boredom. And that's a bit more of I'm not quite sure. I mean, if this is a strong verb that suggests that they're doing some scholarly activity, marking boredom, it's just a little bit wishy-washy. Like, what do they mean by marked boredom? It's actually a bit of a weird way to describe it. So you see there's quite a richness in verb activity. We can contrast that with a more sciencey way of doing references. So here's a good example of it. Scientists tend to just do a whole sentence and then drop in the reference. They don't put a verb there, generally. And what this kind of sentence does is it just imports that fact from another paper, and then you put the reference after it to do the scholarly citizenship of acknowledging other people's knowledge work. So the difference between these two types of verb deployment is actually quite interesting. And in an interdisciplinary workshop, you could just merely get people to go through a paper and just find the verbs. So you'll find that, for instance, in this paper, there's not a lot of verbs to be found. This next sentence just gives the sentence. I'm talking about verb in relation to the reference, so the verb that describes the reference. The reference, again, is just plonked at the end. Here again, boredom, 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 and then the reference is plonked at the end. Okay, so you have to look quite carefully in this paper to find anything where you get this kind of verb work, where you're actually using a verb in relation to the reference. So just be a good idea to, and this exercise achieves a couple of things. So it helps people just understand that disciplinary language happens at the level of the sentence as much as it does in the choice of the content, and it happens in a subtle way around verbs and so on. So that's the language analysis exercise. And so what I do there is I just give them an hour to just mark it up with a pen or on the computer, and then I would have this final, and let's give it a half an hour, discussion. So this is like a debrief and a discussion. So one thing I might ask people to do is tell me 3 things you noticed. And I do that because giving people 3 things to tell you gives them something concrete to do. You know, otherwise they might just sort of sit there and not know what to say. But if you tell them to tell you 3 things, for some reason, people find that easier. And then we can call this, what they're doing here, a report back. And we don't need anything for that, so we at least nothing new. And then we can do a next steps. I like to sort of end my workshop with next steps. Let's give it 15 minutes, half an hour. It gets a bit fuzzy down here, to be honest. Like, you just program in less and you'll fill up the time. That's what I always find. This just helps me keep track of, you know, how the workshop's going and whether the timing's going to be working or not. Sometimes I just give people an exercise here. So it might be a pair and share or a table discussion. And what are you going to do? With what you learned. And this is a really good thing to do at the end of a workshop, because it gets people to, you know, name an action, so it gives them sort of an intention to walk out the door with. But they always also hear other people name their intentions. They might think, oh, that's a good idea, I hadn't thought to do that. I might go and, you know, do more underlining of a paper, or I might go and talk to someone, or whatever it is. This sort of gets the ideas out of the head of the audience. And again, we don't need anything here. All right, so that is my workshop activity planner for Camille and Kenza.